Biologists will tell you that a mammal of that size, 800 pounds of muscle and bone, cannot survive the Arctic winter without migrating. The calorie math doesn't work. There is no food above the snow line. At 40 below zero, exposed flesh freezes in under 60 seconds. So where do they go? People think they walk south. People think they hide in caves. They are wrong. I know where they go because I fell into one of their bedrooms. I didn't find a cave. I found a structure. I found a biological machine engineered by nature to keep monsters alive while the world above them died of cold. I saw them. Not one, not two. I saw the colony, and I saw what they do to their bodies to survive the long dark. My name is Jack Miller. I spent 20 years walking the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and I'm here to tell you that the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as you think. You have to understand the silence of the North Slope in January. It's not peaceful. It's heavy. The sun doesn't rise for weeks. It's just twilight and darkness and a cold so aggressive it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. In 2004, I was a senior structural integrity inspector. My job was to take a snowcat out to the most remote sections of the pipeline, milepost 300 to 450, deep in the Brooks Range, and check for heave. That's when the permafrost melts and refreezes, twisting the steel supports like paper clips. It's a lonely job. Just you, the wind, and a $50,000 ground-penetrating radar (GPR) unit. You start to see things in the dark. You start to hear voices in the wind. We call it pipeline fever. Most guys quit after 2 seasons. I stayed for 10. I liked the isolation. I liked the machinery. But on January 14th, my equipment started picking up something that shouldn't have been there. I was scanning a ridge near the Adigan Pass. The GPR creates a digital image of what's under the ice: rock, soil, water. But looking at my monitor, I saw a void. A massive spherical empty space about 30 feet below the surface, right next to the pipeline's support struts. Standard procedure says it's a sinkhole, a hazard. If the ground collapses, the pipe snaps and we have an oil spill that destroys the ecosystem. My orders were clear. Drill a test bore, drop a camera, confirm the stability. I thought I was looking at a geological pocket, maybe an ice cave. I drilled the hole. I lowered the fiber optic camera into the dark. I expected to see ice. I expected to see rock. Instead, on my grainy black and white monitor, I saw walls. Smooth, packed walls. And lining those walls, row upon row, were pods. I wasn't looking at a sinkhole. I was looking at a hive. And when my camera light hit the nearest pod, the wall moved. That was the day I learned that hibernation isn't just sleep. It's a process. And we had just woken them up. The temperature gauge on the dash of my snowcat read -42 degrees. At that temperature, steel becomes brittle. Hydraulic fluid turns into jelly if you don't keep the heaters running. The air itself seems to thicken, turning into an icy fog that hangs suspended over the tundra. I was parked at milepost 342, a desolate stretch of the pipeline about 80 miles south of Deadhorse. The landscape here is alien. Just endless rolling white hills, the Brooks Range cutting jagged teeth into the southern horizon, and the pipeline, that 4-foot-wide steel artery, hovering 6 feet off the ground on its vertical support members, VSMs. My job that day was routine monitoring. The permafrost in this sector was unstable. We had sensors indicating ground heave, meaning the ice below was shifting. If the ice heaves too much, it can buckle the support struts. If a strut buckles, the pipe bends. If the pipe bends, we have a catastrophic failure. I suited up. Vapor barrier underwear, wool mid-layer, heavy-down parka, insulated bibs, bunny boots. It takes 20 minutes just to get dressed. I grabbed the GPR unit, a sled-mounted radar system that looks like a lawnmower from Mars, and stepped out into the wind. The wind up there doesn't just blow, it screams. It finds the smallest gap in your gear and inserts a needle of ice. I dragged the GPR sled towards the base of VSM 409. I calibrated the screen. The radar sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground. It bounces back when it hits something with a different dielectric constant than the soil. Rock bounces hard. Water bounces soft. Ice is transparent. I began the sweep. Beep, beep, beep. The screen showed the usual strata. Layers of gravel, permafrost, and bedrock. Boring. Predictable. I moved 10 feet to the west, closer to a snowdrift that had piled up against the ridge. Beep. The monitor lit up with a solid red mass. I stopped. I recalibrated. Sometimes the machine glitches if it hits a buried drum or a pocket of methane gas. I ran the pass again. Same result. But it wasn't a drum. It was a void. A massive, perfect cavity starting 12 feet down and extending. God, the signal faded out at 40 feet. It was huge, and the shape was wrong. Nature makes jagged holes. Nature makes fissures. This was rounded. It looked like a bubble trapped in the amber of the earth. What the hell is that? I muttered, my voice muffled by my balaclava. I went back to the snowcat and grabbed the core drill. It's a portable rig, essentially a giant corkscrew powered by a gas engine. I needed to punch a hole through the roof of this anomaly and drop a camera down. If it was an ice cave, I needed to know if it was stable enough to support the pipeline strut. The drill roared to life, shattering the silence. The bit bit into the frozen earth. Grind. Screech. It took me an hour to bore through 10 feet of permafrost. The sweat was freezing on my back. Suddenly, the resistance on the drill vanished. The engine revved high as the bit punched through into empty space. I killed the motor. A puff of air shot out of the borehole. I leaned over. In this temperature, usually, the air coming out of the ground is colder than the air above. But the steam hitting my face was warm. It wasn't hot, but it was humid. It fogged up my goggles instantly, and the smell. It didn't smell like methane or crude oil. It smelled like wet wool, ammonia, and something sweet, like rotting mulch. It was organic. I hooked up the fiber optic inspection camera, the snake, to my monitor. I fed the cable down the hole. 10 feet, 12 feet. The monitor flickered, adjusting to the darkness. The LED light on the tip of the camera illuminated the void. I was expecting jagged ice walls. I saw a smooth, curved surface. It looked like stucco or dried mud mixed with straw. It was an engineered wall. I rotated the camera. The space was vast, a cathedral under the ice. And then I saw them. Lining the walls, stacked like wine bottles in a cellar, were shapes. Oblong, dark shapes. They were covered in a thick, grayish substance that looked like hardened foam or papier-mâché. Pods, I whispered. I zoomed in on the nearest one. The surface of the pod was rhythmic, rising and falling, breathing. My brain tried to reject it. Bears? No, bears hibernate in solitary dens. They don't stack themselves in communal hives. Walruses? We were too far inland. I was so focused on the screen, squinting at the grainy image, that I didn't feel the vibration under my boots. The drill had punched through the structural integrity of the roof. The permafrost arch, weakened by the anomaly below, was holding up tons of snow, and me. There was no crack, no warning sound, just a sudden, weightless sensation as the world dropped out from under me. I fell. I hit the slope of the collapse, sliding down a chute of ice and debris. The light of the surface shrank to a pinprick, and then vanished as snow buried the entrance. I tumbled, hitting something hard, bouncing and finally slamming into a soft, yielding surface. I lay there in the pitch black. My ears were ringing. My left shoulder screamed in pain. I scrambled for my flashlight. Click. The beam cut through the dust and steam. I wasn't on the ice anymore. I was inside the anomaly. The air was thick and heavy, warm enough that I felt the sudden urge to unzip my parka. It was humid, dripping with condensation. I swept the light around. I was standing on a floor made of packed earth and bones. Animal bones, caribou antlers, wolf skulls, heaped in the center like a fire pit. But the walls were alive. The light revealed the pods I had seen on the screen. They were everywhere, hundreds of them. They were massive cocoons about 9 feet tall, cemented to the walls with a mud-like resin. They looked like the nest of a mud dauber wasp, but scaled up to nightmare proportions. And right in front of me, where I had landed, one of the cocoons was cracked. I had fallen against it. The impact had shattered the outer shell of dried mud and saliva. Inside the shell, curled in the fetal position, encased in a translucent gel-like membrane, was a face. It was immense. Gray skin, eyes shut tight, a mouth slightly open, revealing flat, grinding teeth. It was covered in thick, white winter fur that was matted down by the gel. It was a Sasquatch, but it wasn't sleeping. It was in suspended animation. Its heart rate must have been 1 beat per minute. I stood frozen, my light shaking on the creature's face. Then the eye under the membrane twitched. The gel around its nostrils bubbled. I had broken the seal. I had let the cold air from the surface mix with the warm air of the hive. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the sleepers were waking up. The sound of a breaking seal is distinctive. It's a wet, sucking noise like a boot being pulled out of deep mud. I stood there, paralyzed, the beam of my flashlight shaking violently in my hand. The crack in the mud casing widened. A thick, translucent fluid began to ooze out, dripping onto the bone floor. It smelled pungent, chemical, like high-grade antifreeze mixed with spoiled milk. The face inside the pod contorted. The eyelids, heavy and crusted with the gel, fluttered. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I dove behind the central pile of caribou antlers and wolf skulls, killing my light. I lay in the darkness, breathing through my mouth to keep my teeth from chattering. The silence of the tomb was gone. It was replaced by the sound of movement, slop, thud. Something heavy hit the floor. I risked a peek, shielding the lens of my flashlight with my fingers to let only a sliver of light escape. The creature had fallen out of its cocoon. It was on its hands and knees, retching. It was covered in that viscous slime. It coughed, a deep, wet, hacking sound, and expelled a lungful of fluid. This wasn't a movie monster roaring for blood. This was a biological organism coming out of deep stasis. It was vulnerable. It was weak. As it wiped the slime from its eyes, I got my first clear look at the physiology of a winter-phase Sasquatch. It was different from the descriptions you hear in the summer. It was bulkier. Under the wet, matted white fur, there was a layer of fat so thick it looked like armor. Its skin was pale gray, almost blue. Its hands were massive, the fingers webbed with skin, an adaptation for swimming or snow, I wasn't sure. But the most terrifying part was the steam. Heat was radiating off its body in waves. The chamber was naturally warm, likely a geothermal vent, which explained why they chose this spot. But the creature itself was a furnace. It was burning calories at an insane rate to restart its metabolism. It sat up, bracing itself against the wall. It let out a low moan, clutching its head. It looked like a man waking up from a 10-year coma. Then it froze. It turned its head slowly. It sniffed the air. It smelled me. Or rather, it smelled the cold air I had brought with me. The hole I had punched in the roof was 20 feet above us, a jagged skylight pouring freezing drafts into their sauna. The temperature in the chamber was dropping. The creature's amber eyes snapped open. They didn't glow. They reflected the ambient light like a cat's. It looked at the pile of bones where I was hiding. It didn't roar, it didn't charge. It did something that scared me more. It looked at the other pods. There were hundreds of them, rows and rows of sleeping giants, stacked like cordwood up to the ceiling. The creature dragged itself to the next pod in the line. It banged its fist against the dried mud shell. Thump, thump. It was waking the others. My mind raced. I was an intruder in a hive. I had violated their sanctuary. And now the sentry was sounding the alarm. I looked up at the hole I fell through. It was too high. The walls were slick with condensation and slime. I couldn't climb out. I had a pistol in my chest rig, a .44 Magnum, standard issue for bear country. I pulled it out. The metal felt cold and heavy. I had a choice. I could shoot the waking creature, put it down before it regained its strength. But the noise, the gunshot would be deafening in this echo chamber. It might shatter the other pods. It might bring the whole roof down. Or I could try to find another way out. I looked past the creature, deeper into the shadows of the cavern. The floor sloped downward, and there was a draft coming from that direction. A warm draft. Airflow. If there was airflow, there was an exit. The creature was still banging on the neighbor's pod, muttering in a low, guttural language. Grua. I made my decision. I holstered the gun. I wasn't going to start a war in a basement full of monsters. I crept out from behind the bone pile. I stayed low, moving crab-like towards the darker end of the chamber. My bunny boots were designed for snow, not slime. They squeaked softly on the wet earth. The creature stopped banging. I froze. I turned my head slowly. The creature was looking right at me. It was standing now, unsteady, wobbling on legs that hadn't been used in months, but standing. It was easily 8 feet tall. It didn't attack. It pointed a long slime-covered finger at the hole in the roof. Then it pointed at me. Then it pointed at the other pods. Its expression wasn't rage, it was accusation. You broke the seal. You are killing us. I felt a wave of guilt hit me harder than the fear. I hadn't just stumbled into a den, I had compromised their life support system. I'm sorry, I whispered, knowing it couldn't understand English, but feeling the need to say it. The creature took a step toward me. It bared its teeth. Flat, grinding molars meant for crushing bone and bark. I turned and ran. I sprinted into the darkness, away from the light of the hole, plunging deeper into the hive. The tunnel narrowed. The walls became closer, pressing in. The smell of ammonia got stronger, stinging my eyes. I could hear the creature behind me. It wasn't running. It was shambling, dragging its heavy feet. But it was coming. And behind it, I heard the sound I dreaded most. Crack, snap, slop. More seals were breaking. The hive was waking up. Before I tell you what I found in the belly of that mountain, I need to ask you something. If you were in my boots, trapped under the ice, hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist, would you have used that .44 Magnum? Or would you have run? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see the pipeline files fully declassified, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that the truth matters. Now, back to the dark. I ran until my lungs burned. The tunnel wasn't built for humans. It was a natural lava tube, smoothed over centuries by water and then modified by massive hands. The floor was uneven, slick with a mixture of algae and that translucent hibernation gel. Every step was a gamble. My bunny boots, giant, white, rubberized military boots designed for 50 degrees, were clumsy. They slapped against the wet stone, echoing like gunshots in the confined space. I wasn't cold anymore. I was suffocating. As I descended, the temperature spiked. It went from the freezing draft near the entrance to a humid, stifling 80 degrees in a matter of minutes. I was wearing extreme cold weather gear, a down parka, insulated bibs, thermal layers. I was cooking inside my own suit. Sweat poured down my back, stinging the chafed skin. I ripped my zipper down, tearing at the Velcro, struggling to vent the heat while keeping my pace. Behind me, the sound of pursuit was changing. At first, it had been the shambling, clumsy stumbles of a creature fighting muscle atrophy. Now the footsteps were rhythmic. Slap, slap, slap. Heavy, purposeful. The sentry was waking up. His metabolism was firing. He was hunting. I rounded a sharp corner, my shoulder scraping against the rock wall. The rock was warm to the touch. Not just ambient warm, hot. I stopped for a split second to catch my breath, aiming my flashlight down the corridor. The air here was thick with sulfur. It tasted like rotten eggs and copper. My GPR training kicked in. Sulfur, heat, igneous rock. I was moving toward a geothermal vent. That was the secret. That was how they survived. They hadn't just dug a hole. They had found a natural radiator. The entire colony was an engineering marvel, positioned directly over a volcanic fissure to harvest the Earth's bleeding heat. I pushed forward. The tunnel opened up into a secondary chamber, smaller than the main hive but far more active. In the center of the room was a pool of black water. Steam curled off the surface in thick, lazy spirals. The water was bubbling gently, bloop bloop, releasing pockets of gas. But it wasn't the water that stopped me. It was what was in the water. There were smaller pods here, not the mud-hardened vertical coffins of the adults. These were baskets, woven structures made of willow branches and sinew, floating in the shallows of the hot spring like lily pads. I stepped closer, mesmerized. Inside the baskets were infants. They were tiny, maybe the size of human toddlers covered in sparse dark fuzz. They weren't in deep stasis like the adults. They were sleeping, twitching, sucking their thumbs. The warm, mineral-rich steam kept them alive, kept them growing while the winter raged above. This wasn't just a dormitory. It was a nursery. A wave of primal terror washed over me. In nature, there is no place more dangerous than between a mother and her young. I had just run straight into the heart of the colony's future. Scree! The shriek came from the tunnel behind me. It wasn't a grunt anymore. It was a high-pitched, deafening scream of rage that vibrated my fillings. The sentry had found my scent. He knew where I was going. I scrambled away from the pool. I scanned the room for an exit. There, on the far wall, a narrow fissure, barely 3 feet wide. A draft was pulling the steam into it. Ventilation. I sprinted for the crack. I didn't look back at the sleeping babies. I squeezed my bulk into the fissure. It was tight. My equipment vest snagged on the jagged rocks. I had to turn sideways, sucking in my gut, scraping my face against the stone. I pushed. I grunted. I forced myself through. The moment I popped out the other side, the tunnel collapsed. Not the roof. The creature. The sentry slammed into the opening of the fissure I had just exited. He was too big. His massive shoulders wedged into the rock. He roared, a sound of pure frustration, and swiped his arm into the gap. His hand, tipped with black claws the size of chisels, slashed the air inches from my face. I fell backward, scrambling on my elbows. He was stuck. For now. He glared at me through the gap, his face a mask of gray skin and bared teeth. He was fully awake now. The gel was gone from his eyes. They burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. He wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. He hated me. He started to pull. He braced his legs and heaved against the rock. The stone groaned. Dust showered down. He was trying to widen the opening by sheer brute force. I scrambled to my feet. I turned my flashlight down the new tunnel. It was different here. The walls were lined with something shiny. I walked closer, wiping the sweat from my eyes. The walls were embedded with metal. Rusted, twisted metal. I saw a bolt head. I saw a fragment of a steel beam. I saw a faded yellow sign, half-eaten by oxidation, with the letters USAR, RP, U.S. Army Corps. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a natural cave. This tunnel intersected with something man-made, something old. I knew the history of the Brooks Range. In the 50s, during the Cold War, the military built DEW line, distant early warning stations all over the Arctic to watch for Soviet bombers. Most were abandoned, buried by snow and time. The Sasquatch hadn't just found a geothermal vent. They had found an abandoned Cold War bunker. They were using our own forgotten infrastructure as part of their hive. I followed the metal. The tunnel floor changed from rock to rotting concrete. I stepped over rusted conduit pipes. I was running toward the unknown, but at least it was human unknown. But the sound behind me didn't stop. Crunch. The sound of rock fracturing. The sentry was breaking through. I broke into a run again. The concrete corridor seemed to go on forever, descending deeper into the mountain. And then I heard it. Not the scream of the beast, but a hum. A low, electrical hum. Active machinery. How? These bunkers had been dead for 50 years. There was no power grid out here. I turned a corner and skidded to a halt. I was standing on a metal catwalk overlooking a massive cylindrical silo. And in the center of the silo, bathed in the red glow of emergency lights that should have burned out decades ago, was a machine. It wasn't military. It looked jury-rigged. It was a generator, but it was modified with bones, with leather belts, with crude copper wiring hammered into shape by hand. It was running, and standing next to it, operating the levers with a terrifying, practiced precision, was another one of them. This one was smaller, older. Its fur was patchy. It wore a necklace of spark plugs. It turned and looked up at me on the catwalk. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It reached for a lever on the wall, a lever marked ventilation purge. I realized then that I wasn't dealing with animals. I was dealing with engineers, and they were about to flush the system. The sound of a 50-year-old industrial ventilation system coming back to life is not a hum. It is a scream. When the old gray-furred engineer pulled that lever, the physics of the room changed instantly. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the mountain, massive turbine fans, dormant since the Eisenhower administration, groaned into motion. War thunk, war thunk. The air pressure in the silo dropped so fast my ears popped violently, a sharp pain like an ice pick to the eardrum. Dust, rust flakes, and loose debris were sucked upward into the intake vents high above the catwalk. The purge wasn't meant to clean the air. It was a tactical defense mechanism. It was designed to evacuate oxygen in case of a fire, or an intrusion. I grabbed the railing of the catwalk. The wind roared past me, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me toward the massive blades spinning up in the ceiling. The engineer didn't look at me. He didn't need to. He stood by his console, watching the dials on the generator twitch. He was calm. He was doing a job. He was the maintenance man of the apocalypse. But I had a bigger problem than the wind. Crash. Behind me, the concrete wall where the tunnel met the silo exploded inward. A shower of rubble and rebar sprayed across the metal grating. The sentry had broken through. He squeezed his massive bulk through the hole, shaking off the dust. He was bleeding from where the jagged rock had cut his shoulders, but he didn't care. He saw me on the catwalk. He saw the engineer at the console. The sentry roared, a sound that was swallowed instantly by the screaming turbines, and charged. I was trapped. Behind me, an enraged 800-pound biological tank. In front of me, a sheer drop of 40 feet to the concrete floor of the silo. Above me, giant fans trying to suck the air out of my lungs. I did the only thing a sane man could do. I jumped. I vaulted over the railing. I didn't aim for the floor. That would have shattered my legs. I aimed for a pile of what looked like canvas tarps and debris heaped in the corner of the room near the generator. I fell through the air for 2 seconds that felt like 2 hours. I hit the pile. It wasn't canvas. It was bones. I crashed into a mountain of dry, brittle bones. Thousands of them. Caribou ribs, moose femurs, and smaller, unrecognizable skulls. They shattered under my weight, absorbing the impact but slicing into my parka like razors. I tumbled down the side of the bone pile, landing hard on the concrete floor, coughing in the dust. My right ankle twisted, sending a bolt of white-hot fire up my leg. I scrambled to my feet, limping, dragging my bad leg. I ducked behind the massive, vibrating housing of the generator. I peeked around the corner. The sentry was on the catwalk looking down. He couldn't jump. He was too heavy. The fall would kill him. He paced back and forth, slamming his fists against the railing, screaming at the engineer. The engineer ignored him. He pointed a long, callous finger at a service ladder on the far wall. "Go down." The sentry grabbed the ladder. The metal groaned. He began to descend, hand over hand, moving with terrifying speed. I looked at the generator next to me. Up close, it was a nightmare of ingenuity. The original diesel engine was gone. In its place was a firebox, a modified furnace, and feeding that furnace was a conveyor belt made of old tank treads. I looked at what was on the belt. It wasn't coal. It wasn't wood. It was the bones. They were burning the bones. They were using the oil-rich marrow of thousands of prey animals to fuel the fire that boiled the water, which turned the turbine, which created the electricity that kept the lights on and the nursery warm. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The realization hit me hard. I am not exploring a cave. I am inside a factory. I checked my chest rig. My radio was smashed. The fall had cracked the casing. My GPR unit was gone, left back in the tunnel. I had my flashlight, my .44 Magnum with 5 rounds left. I kept one empty chamber for safety, and a knife. And I had a sentry 20 feet from the ground and closing. I needed to move. But where? The room was a dead end, a cylinder of concrete. Then, I saw it. On the side of the generator housing, almost obscured by layers of grime and grease, was a schematic plate, a blueprint of the facility etched in brass. I shone my light on it, my hands shaking. Station 4, air circulation and heating. Connections, fuel storage, north. Barracks, east. Pipeline access, up west. Pipeline access. My heart skipped a beat. Of course, the military built these stations to support the early surveys of the region. There was an access point to the surface, or at least to the maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the pipeline route. I looked at the schematic. The access tunnel was marked with a symbol, a vertical shaft with a ladder. I looked around the room. On the west wall, hidden behind stacks of rotting crates, was a heavy blast door. Stenciled on it in fading yellow paint, maintenance access. I looked at the ladder. The sentry was 10 feet from the floor. He dropped the last few feet, landing with a heavy thud that shook the concrete. He stood up, scanning the room. He sniffed the air. He smelled my blood. I had cut my hand on the bones. I didn't wait. I broke cover and sprinted for the blast door. The sentry saw me. He let out a bark of triumph and charged. He didn't run like a man. He ran like a gorilla, using his knuckles to propel himself forward, covering ground with impossible speed. I reached the door. It had a wheel handle, the kind you see on submarines. I grabbed it. It was cold, rusted shut. "Come on, you son of a bitch," I screamed, adrenaline flooding my veins. I threw my weight against the wheel. Crack! It turned an inch. The sentry was halfway across the room. He crashed through the bone pile, sending fragments flying like shrapnel. I pulled again. My muscles tore. My injured ankle screamed. The wheel spun. The latches disengaged with a metallic clunk. I yanked the door open. It was heavy, solid steel. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut just as a massive weight impacted the other side. Boom! The door buckled inward. Dust fell from the ceiling. I spun the locking wheel from the inside, sealing it. Boom! Boom! He was throwing his shoulder against it. But this door was built to withstand a Soviet nuclear blast. It would hold against a Sasquatch. For a few minutes, I leaned against the cold steel, gasping for air, sliding down to the floor. I was safe from the sentry, but I was now in the barracks. I turned my flashlight into the room. It was a long, narrow hallway lined with bunk beds. The mattresses had rotted away decades ago, but the beds weren't empty. I walked down the aisle, the beam of my light dancing over the horrors of the past. There were skeletons in the bunks, human skeletons, still wearing scraps of green army fatigues, but they hadn't died in their sleep. The bones were scattered. Skulls were crushed. Rib cages were torn open. And in the center of the room, scratched into the metal wall with a knife point, were words. Frantic, jagged words left by the last survivor of Station 4, 50 years ago. I stepped closer to read the epitaph of the lost platoon. They live in the walls. The cold doesn't kill them. They want the heat. We are the fuel. I stared at the message. The realization washed over me. The military didn't just abandon this place. They were harvested. The colony had been here before the soldiers. The soldiers built the heater and the creatures took it. They took the technology, and they ate the technicians. And now, I was the spare part they didn't need. I looked at the end of the hallway. There was the vertical shaft, the pipeline access. But standing at the base of the shaft, blocking my only way out, was something else. It wasn't a sentry. It wasn't an engineer. It was a female. But she wasn't like the others. She was draped in things. Dog tags. Shredded Kevlar. A helmet hanging from her belt like a trophy. She was the matriarch, the queen of the bunker. And she wasn't holding a rock. She was holding a flare gun. My flare gun. The one I had dropped when I fell. She raised it. She looked at me with eyes that were ancient and utterly void of mercy. She knew what the orange gun did. She had seen me use it before? No. She had seen the soldiers use them. She pointed it at the ceiling, at the fire suppression system. If she pulled that trigger, she wouldn't shoot me. She would trigger the halon gas system, the oxygen eaters. She was going to suffocate me. I froze. My hand was hovering over my holster, but I knew I was too slow. Even if I drew the magnum and put a bullet in her chest, her finger would spasm. The flare would fire. The heat would hit the sensor. The halon would dump. Halon 1301. It's a colorless, odorless gas used in high-tech server rooms and military bunkers. It doesn't put out fire by water. It breaks the chemical chain reaction of combustion. It also displaces oxygen. If she triggered that system, this sealed hallway would become a vacuum in less than 10 seconds. We would both asphyxiate. But it wasn't just us. My mind flashed back to the nursery. The baskets floating in the warm pool. The infants. "No!" I shouted. My voice cracked, echoing off the steel walls. The matriarch didn't flinch. She held the orange flare gun steady, aimed directly at the heat sensor on the ceiling. Her finger tightened on the trigger. She was ready to die to kill the intruder. It was the ultimate scorched earth policy. "Listen to me," I screamed, slowly raising my hands, palms open. "Halon is heavy. It's heavier than air." She tilted her head. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Desperation. Warning. I had to communicate physics to a creature from the Stone Age using nothing but pantomime. I pointed at the ceiling sensor. I made a whoosh sound, bringing my hands down rapidly to the floor. I crouched low, simulating the gas sinking. Then I pointed toward the blast door, toward the generator room and the tunnel beyond it, the tunnel that led down to the nursery. I mimicked a baby. I cradled my arms, rocking an invisible infant. Then I grabbed my throat and made a choking sound. "If you fire that, the gas goes down. It goes to the babies. You kill them." It was a gamble. A massive, terrified gamble. She watched me. Her amber eyes narrowed. She looked at the flare gun in her hand. She looked at the sensor. Then she looked at the floor vents. She was processing. This was the miracle of the encounter. I watched the gears turn behind those ancient eyes. She wasn't just a brute. She was a general. She knew the layout of this bunker better than I did. She knew the airflow. She realized I was right. The tension in her arm relaxed. She lowered the flare gun by an inch, but she didn't step aside. She was still blocking the ladder. She needed proof that I wasn't a threat. I looked at my chest rig. The .44 Magnum. The boomstick. To her, I was a small, soft thing with a loud, death-dealing claw. As long as I had it, I was an enemy. I took a deep breath. This was the hardest thing I've ever done. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." I slowly, with 2 fingers, unclipped the safety strap on my holster. I pulled the heavy revolver out. I held it by the barrel, offering the grip to the air. She hissed, baring her teeth, tightening her grip on the flare gun again. "No, no," I said softly. I crouched down and placed the gun on the metal floor. Then I slid it across the hallway. The metal clattered against the grating, sliding until it hit her massive, calloused feet. I stood up, unarmed. "I just want to leave," I said. I pointed to the ladder behind her. "Up I go up. You stay, babies stay safe." She looked down at the gun. She looked at me. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant roaring of the turbines I had escaped from. Then she made a decision. She didn't pick up the gun. She kicked it. With a casual flick of her foot, she sent my .44 spinning away into the darkness under the bunk beds. She lowered the flare gun completely. She let out a huff of air, a sound that wasn't a growl but a release of tension. She stepped aside. She moved her massive bulk to the left, clearing the path to the vertical shaft ladder. She looked at me, and then she pointed a long finger at the ladder. Her expression was clear. "Go. Now." Before I changed my mind. I didn't hesitate. I limped forward, fighting the urge to run, keeping my movements slow and predictable. I passed within 2 feet of her. I could smell her. She didn't smell like the males, that ammonia and musk scent. She smelled like dry earth and ozone. Up close, I saw the scars on her face, the graying fur. The trophies of dead soldiers hanging from her belt clinked softly. She watched me pass. She could have reached out and snapped my neck with a twitch of her wrist. I reached the ladder. It was old, rusted iron rungs set into a concrete tube. I grabbed the first rung. The cold metal bit into my bare hands. I had lost my gloves in the fall. I looked back one last time. She was watching me. She hadn't moved. She was standing guard over the hallway that led to her nursery, holding a human flare gun, the queen of a forgotten kingdom. I nodded to her, a precise, human nod of respect. She didn't nod back. She just blinked. I started to climb. The shaft was tight, dark, and endless. My ankle throbbed with every step. My lungs burned. But I climbed with the energy of a man who had just cheated death. I climbed for what felt like an hour. The air grew colder. The smell of sulfur faded, replaced by the smell of frost and hydraulic fluid. Finally, my headlamp hit something above me. A hatch. I braced myself against the ladder and pushed. It didn't budge. Ice had sealed it from the outside. Panic flared again. I was trapped in a chimney. I hammered on the wheel. "Come on!" I braced my back against the wall of the shaft and pushed with my legs, screaming with effort. Crack! The ice gave way. The hatch groaned open, dumping a pile of snow onto my face. I pulled myself up, gasping, clawing at the frozen ground. I rolled out onto the snow. The wind hit me instantly, a 60-mile-per-hour gale at 40 below zero. But it felt like a kiss. It was fresh. It was clean. I was out. I looked around. I was about 200 yards away from where the snowcat was parked. The pipeline loomed overhead, a silent giant in the polar twilight. I had escaped the hive. But as I lay there looking up at the aurora borealis dancing green and purple across the sky, I realized the nightmare wasn't over, because I wasn't alone on the surface. I heard a sound over the wind, not a roar, not a machine. Beep, beep, beep. It was a tracking signal. I sat up, squinting through the blowing snow. Parked next to my snowcat was another vehicle, a black, unmarked tracked carrier, the kind used by private security firms. Men were standing around the hole I had drilled, the hole I fell through. They were setting up a tripod, a winch. They weren't rescuing me. They were preparing to go down. I realized then that the anomaly wasn't unknown. Someone knew it was there. Someone knew about the bunker. And they had been waiting for a fool like me to open the door. I was freezing, unarmed, and injured. And I was about to walk into a different kind of trap. I dragged myself through the snow, using the pipeline's vertical support struts as cover. My ankle was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic agony that synced with my heartbeat. I was 50 yards away when I saw the logo on the side of the black tracked vehicle. It wasn't a government seal, it wasn't the army, it was a corporate logo, a stylized helix inside a drop of oil. Ethelgard Biotics. I knew the name. They were a subsidiary of the massive conglomerate that owned the drilling rights to Sector 4. They weren't oilmen. They were pharmaceutical developers. 3 men were standing around the borehole I had drilled. They wore white tactical snow camouflage, night vision goggles flipped up on their helmets, and carried suppressed carbines. They moved with the fluid, silent coordination of a kill squad. A 4th man, the leader, was standing by the winch. He wasn't wearing camo. He wore a sleek, heated parka that probably cost more than my annual salary. He was holding a tablet, looking at a readout. "Seismic activity confirmed," he said into a headset. His voice carried over the wind. "Subject is active. Heart rates are elevating in the nursery. We have a breach." My blood ran cold. They knew about the nursery. They knew about the babies. They weren't here to study. They were here to collect. I should have stayed hidden. I should have crawled into the dark and waited for them to leave. But the image of that matriarch, the way she had lowered the flare gun, the way she had trusted me, it stuck in my throat. I stepped out from behind the steel strut. I raised my hands. "You blow that hole," I shouted, my voice raw, "and you bring the whole mountain down." The tactical team spun around instantly. 3 red laser dots danced on my chest. The leader didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head. He looked at me, ragged, covered in slime and blood, shivering in the Arctic wind with a look of mild annoyance. "Mr. Miller," he said smoothly, "we were wondering when you'd pop up. Your GPS signal went dead 2 hours ago. We assumed the tenants had processed you." "The tenants?" I spat, limping closer. "They're living beings, and you're trespassing on a federal pipeline easement." The leader chuckled. He tapped his tablet. "Federal, Mr. Miller, we own the lease on everything from the surface down to the mantle. And what's down there isn't livestock. It's proprietary biological data. Do you have any idea what an enzyme that prevents cellular crystallization at -40 degrees is worth? It's the cure for frostbite. It's the key to cryogenic stasis. It's $1 billion a gram." He nodded to his men. "Secure him. Then prep the breaching charge. We need a specimen intact, preferably a juvenile." 2 of the soldiers moved toward me. "Don't do it," I screamed, backing up against the pipeline strut. "The ground is unstable. The permafrost is heaving. If you use explosives, you'll fracture the VSM support. You'll rupture the main line." "The line is resilient," the leader said, bored. "Plant the charge." One of the soldiers knelt by the hole. He pulled a brick of C4 from his pack. He set the timer. 5 seconds. The soldiers grabbed me, throwing me into the snow, pressing my face into the ice. Boom. The explosion wasn't loud. The snow muffled it, but the shockwave was sickening. The ground didn't just shake. It rippled. The leader walked to the edge of the smoking hole. "Deployment team, drop the gas, knock them out, grab the smallest one, and winching up." He leaned over the edge, peering into the smoke. And then, the ground screamed. It wasn't the sound of the explosion. It was the sound of the permafrost arch, the roof of the hive, finally giving up. The structural integrity, already compromised by my drill and now shattered by the C4, collapsed. The ground around the leader simply vanished. He didn't even have time to scream. He dropped straight down into the darkness as the sinkhole widened, swallowing the winch, the equipment crates, and the front half of their tracked vehicle. The soldiers scrambled back, slipping on the shifting ice. Pull back," one of them shouted. But the hive wasn't just collapsing, it was erupting. From the cloud of dust and snow rising from the crater, a shape emerged. It leaped from the depths, latching onto the lip of the ice with claws that dug deep into the frozen soil. It was the sentry. He was unrecognizable. He was covered in gray dust, blood, and the wreckage of the collapse. He roared, a sound so loud it physically hurt my ears, drowning out the wind. He didn't look at me. He looked at the men in white. The soldiers opened fire. Foot. The suppressed rounds hit the sentry's chest, puffing little clouds of fur and dust. It didn't matter. His adrenaline, his rage, his sheer biological density made him a tank. He moved faster than a human eye could track. He crossed the 20 feet between the hole and the nearest soldier in a single bound. He backhanded the man. I heard the crack of the helmet shattering, and the soldier was sent flying through the air like a rag doll, landing 40 feet away in the darkness. The second soldier panicked. He switched to full auto. Muzzle flashes lit up the night. The sentry grabbed the barrel of the carbine. He ripped it from the man's hands and bent it in half. Then he grabbed the soldier by the vest and threw him, into the collapsing sinkhole. The third soldier, the one holding me, let me go. He turned to run for the remaining snowcat. He didn't make it. Another shape pulled itself out of the hole. The matriarch. She wasn't fast like the sentry. She was methodical. She picked up a heavy case of drilling equipment, probably weighing 200 pounds, and hurled it. It caught the running soldier in the back of the knees. He went down screaming. I was lying under the pipeline strut, watching the massacre. It wasn't a battle. It was a cleaning. The Sasquatch were apex predators in their element. The humans were slow, blind, and fragile. The sentry stood over the wreckage of the Black Ops team. He was panting, steam billowing from his mouth. He was bleeding from a dozen bullet wounds, but he was standing. He turned his head. He looked at the pipeline. The explosion and the collapse had shifted the ground. The vertical support member, VSM, I was hiding under was tilting. The massive steel pipe above us was groaning, bending under the strain. If that pipe snapped, 2 million barrels of hot crude oil would pour into the crater. It would drown the hive. It would kill the nursery. The sentry looked at the pipe. Then he looked at me. He remembered me. The intruder. The one who ran. He took a step toward me. I didn't reach for a weapon. I pointed up at the pipe. I screamed the only thing that mattered. "It's going to break!" The sentry stopped. He looked up. He saw the steel bending. He heard the rivets popping. He understood. He looked back at the hole, at his family down in the dark. Then he looked at the massive steel I-beam supporting the pipe. The beam was slipping off its concrete footer. He roared at the matriarch. He gestured to the beam. They rushed past me. 2 monsters, weighing nearly a ton combined, moved to the base of the sinking support strut. They wedged their shoulders under the steel crossbeam. They braced their legs in the frozen mud, and they pushed. It was impossible. It was physics-defying. But I watched it happen. Muscles that looked like bridge cables bunched under their fur. They groaned, a primal sound of effort. Slowly, agonizingly, the sinking strut stopped moving. They were holding up the pipeline. They were holding up the weight of the industrialized world to save their children from the oil. But they couldn't hold it forever. "Help us!" I heard a voice inside my head. It wasn't telepathy. It was my own conscience screaming. I looked at the damaged Black Ops vehicle. The winch was still attached to the rear bumper. The cable was dangling. I scrambled up. My ankle was useless, so I crawled. I reached the vehicle. I grabbed the winch cable. I dragged it to the support strut. I wrapped it around the steel beam the Sasquatch were holding up. I hooked it tight. I crawled back to the vehicle. I punched the dashboard controls. Winch in. The cable went taut. The motor whined. The vehicle groaned, its tracks digging into the ice, acting as an anchor. The tension transferred from the creature's shoulders to the steel cable. The pipe stabilized. The sentry slumped against the beam. Exhausted, he looked at the cable. He looked at the vehicle. Then he looked at me inside the cab. For a second, across the devastation of the snowfield, we weren't enemies. We were co-workers. We were a crew trying to keep the system from failing. But the silence was broken by the sound of sirens in the distance. Real sirens. The explosion had tripped the pipeline's automatic alarms. The real maintenance crews were coming. The state troopers were coming. The sentry heard it. He tapped the matriarch. They let go of the beam. The winch held. They walked to the edge of the sinkhole. They looked down into their broken home. The sentry looked at me one last time. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He just bared his teeth, not in a snarl, but in a grimace of pain. Then they jumped. They vanished back into the dark earth, returning to the only place they were safe. I was left alone on the ice, surrounded by bodies, holding a winch controller, waiting for the flashing lights to crest the hill. The silence returned as quickly as the violence had started. The only sound was the wind hissing through the bent struts of the pipeline and the distant rhythmic thumping of a helicopter rotor cutting through the Arctic night. I sat in the snow, my back against the track of the destroyed mercenary vehicle. My ankle was the size of a grapefruit. My hands were frostbitten, white and waxy at the fingertips. I watched the hole. Steam was still rising from it, a column of white vapor connecting the underworld to the sky. But nothing moved. The sentry and the matriarch were gone. They had retreated to the deep tunnels, to the nursery, to the heat. 10 minutes later, the first company helicopter landed. It wasn't a rescue chopper. It was a heavy-lift Sikorsky, painted matte black. Men in suits, not camo but expensive tailored Arctic gear, stepped out. They didn't run to me. They ran to the hole. They set up a perimeter. They deployed drones. They were assessing the damage, not the loss of life, the loss of the asset. Finally, a man walked over to me. He looked like a lawyer, but he had the cold, dead eyes of a shark. He looked at the bodies of the mercenaries scattered in the snow. He looked at the winch cable holding up the pipeline. He looked at me. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice flat, "you've had a busy night." "They tried to blow the line," I rasped, my teeth chattering. "They almost killed us all." "They were independent contractors," the man said, dismissing the dead with a wave of his hand. "They exceeded their mandate." He knelt down, bringing his face close to mine. "Here is what happened, Jack. You were inspecting a VSM. You discovered a pocket of trapped methane gas. It exploded. The explosion destabilized the permafrost. You heroically secured the line using available equipment. You suffered a concussion and severe hypothermia." He handed me a clipboard, a non-disclosure agreement. It was thick. "And the creatures?" I asked. "The hive?" "What creatures?" He smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "There is nothing down there but unstable soil, which is why we are going to stabilize it, permanently." I signed the paper, not because I wanted the money, but because I realized something. If I told the world, scientists would come, zoologists, tourists, the army. They would dig them up. They would put them in cages. The only way to save them was to bury them. I watched from the window of the medevac chopper as the cement trucks arrived. They didn't just fill the hole with dirt. They pumped thousands of gallons of quick-drying industrial concrete into the sinkhole. They sealed the entrance. They capped the anomaly. To the company, they were plugging a liability. To me, they were closing the front door. But the company didn't know about the blast door. They didn't know about the ventilation shafts that ran miles into the mountains. They didn't know about the Cold War generator. I watched the concrete pour in, and I thought about the matriarch. I thought about the engineer. They were smart. They would hear the concrete coming. They would retreat deeper, seal the lower tunnels, and wait. They had survived the Ice Age. They had survived the U.S. Army. They would survive Ethelgard biotics. I was flown to a private hospital in Anchorage. They fixed my ankle. They treated my frostbite. They deposited a consulting bonus of $200,000 into my account. And they retired me. I never went back to the North Slope. Present day. It's been 20 years. I live in Arizona now. I needed to be somewhere where the ground is dry and the sun is hot enough to burn the memory of that cold out of my bones. But I still track the pipeline data. It's public record if you know where to look. Every winter, around January, there is a strange anomaly in the flow rate sensors near milepost 342. The oil temperature drops slightly in that sector, just a fraction of a degree. The engineers blame it on insulation degradation. They say the heat is leaching into the ground. I know the truth. They are still down there. They are leaching the heat. They are using the pipeline, the very thing that threatened to destroy them, as a life support system. The oil flowing through that steel artery is 140 degrees. It keeps the permafrost warm. It keeps the bunker warm. It keeps the nursery alive. We built a scar across their world, and they adapted. They turned our industrial waste into survival. Sometimes I wonder if the sentry is still alive. I wonder if the babies in the baskets grew up. I wonder if they tell stories about the small man who stopped the sky from falling. I'm an old man now. The NDA I signed expires when I die. That's why I'm recording this. If you are a worker on the slope, if you are a driver on the haul road, and you see steam rising from the ground where there shouldn't be any, don't investigate. Don't be a hero, just drive, because the ground beneath your feet is not empty. It is a home, and the tenants do not like to be disturbed. My name is Jack Miller. I was a pipeline inspector, and I know where the giants sleep.